One of the first problems you'll run into in Dwarf Fortress is getting your dwarves to do things. In Dwarf Fortress, different dwarves can have different jobs, which the game calls labors. If a dwarf doesn't have a labor enabled to do the work you want them to do, they'll stand around drinking and nothing will get done. For instance, if none of your dwarves have the mining labor enabled, and you designate something to be mined, nothing will happen. Managing labor in vanilla Dwarf Fortress is somewhat difficult. The core game includes the ability to assign labors to dwarves, but it can be quite tricky keeping track of what dwarves you've put on what assignments. Can you tell which one of these dwarves is assigned to cooking? Trick question! It's all of them! If you followed the instructions in our previous video, you should be launching the game from the Lazy Noob Pack, and that gives you a couple more options. If you don't have the Lazy Noob Pack, you can find the link to the download in the description below. If thinking about assigning individual jobs to your dwarves is already giving you a headache, the laziest option is to use either autolabor or labor management in DF Hack. If you have DF Hack enabled in the Lazy Noob Pack, it should launch with the game in a separate window that looks like this. Try typing enable autolabor or enable labor manager into the DF Hack window when the game is running. The nuances and differences between these tools is beyond the scope of this video, but as always, the Dwarf Fortress wiki is a wealth of knowledge if you want to learn more. Also, remember that while these tools will make things easier in some ways, they will also take away some of your fine-tuned control over your fort, so it's best not to get too dependent on them. Speaking of fine-tuned control, the Lazy Noob Pack contains a mod that lets you manage individual labors in-game called the Dwarf Manipulator, as well as a similar program you can run in a separate window called Dwarf Therapist. To access Dwarf Manipulator, you can hit U and then L from the main game screen to access a labor management interface. You will see a compact screen with every labor possible along the top and all of your dwarves listed along the left side. If you move your cursor up and down with the arrow keys, you will scroll between your various dwarves. Moving left and right will move you through the various labors. Tapping enter will toggle the labor on for that dwarf. Watch, we're turning Tierist here into a miner. Your other option for assigning labors is Dwarf Therapist. Open the Lazy Noob Pack and before launching the game, go to the Utilities tab and right-click on Dwarf Therapist. You should see it turn green, which means it will launch automatically every time you start the game. If your game is already open, you can load Dwarf Therapist by double-clicking on it in the Lazy Noob Pack. Once the game is open and your fort is loaded, you can switch to the Dwarf Therapist window. Dwarf Therapist will try to connect to your fort automatically, but if that doesn't work, you can click on the retry or connect buttons to get it working. Once it's running properly, you should see a grid with the names of the dwarves in your fort running down the left side and all the labors they can have running along the top. If a dwarf has a labor enabled, the box at the grid intersection of his name and that labor should be shaded in. If you want to assign a labor to a dwarf or remove a labor he already has assigned, click on the box and you'll see it change status. Before you switch back to the Dwarf Fortress window, you're going to want to click Commit Changes, so that the changes you've made will be saved into the game. Now you know how to assign individual labors to a dwarf, but what labors should you enable for which dwarves? If you're trying to build a workshop, but it's not getting completed, you can look at the unfinished building with the Q key, and the game will display a message that says, Waiting for construction, needs? In this case, our workshop needs weaving. Go to your labor manager of choice, and check to see if you have any dwarves enabled for weaving. If you do have someone enabled for weaving, but the workshop still isn't being built, hover your mouse over the dwarf's current job in the Dwarf Therapist or tap T in Manipulator until their jobs are shown. Dwarves will only do one job at a time, and they don't spend all their time working. If you have a dwarf chopping down a whole forest, he might not have free time to come and build your loom, even if he has that labor enabled. Likewise, dwarves are not robots or slaves. They do have lives outside of working for the fort, and often you will have to wait until a dwarf finishes drinking or sleeping, for example, before they punch the clock and begin their assigned labors again. It's important to spread the labors evenly around your dwarves if you want to get things done. If your miner is also your cook, you could end up with some very hungry dwarves. Some labors require tools. Woodcutting requires an axe, mining requires a pick, and hunting requires a crossbow. Many other labors require a corresponding workshop. For instance, making a wooden bed requires a dwarf with the carpenter labor enabled and a carpenter's workshop. It's also important to remember that some workshops can have multiple labors attached to them. Bone carving and stone crafting both take place at a craftstorce workshop. Other labors only require materials like construction. Finally, some, like fishing, require no tools or workshops at all. Another thing to consider when assigning labors is skill. In the Dwarf Therapist window, if a dwarf has any experience at all with a skill, you'll see a number inside that skill's box. Higher numbers mean the dwarf will do the job either faster, better, or both. Your dwarves will enjoy eating the meals made by a level 20 cook more than the products of a level 1 novice. This video isn't about dwarf happiness, but it's worth knowing that it's somewhat important for your dwarves not to be too grumpy. And as always, if you're unsure about anything, it's always a good idea to check the forums or the Dwarf Fortress wiki for help. Thanks for listening. See you next time.